Hello, everybody. My name is Marty Barron. I'm the executive editor of the Washington Post, and I want to thank you all for coming. The subject of today's event is one very close to my heart because local news has actually defined the vast majority of my career. My own experience, I think, gives some perspective on how much things have changed for journalism at the local level. So my first job out of college was in my native state of Florida at the Miami Herald, but not in Miami, actually in one of its bureaus up the Florida coast in a town called Stewart. Stewart at the time had all of 12,000 people. The entire county, Martin County, had 50,000 people. Few people, but it sure had a lot of news coverage. The Miami Herald, based 110 miles to the south of Stewart, had two reporters there, including me, in 1976 and into 1977, and after I left as well. 6 days a week, we filled a full page a day with stories we wrote and photos we took. Very bad photos, by the way. There was a local paper, the Stewart News, which had a fairly robust staff for a newspaper of its size. The Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, based 82 miles to the south, had a correspondent in Stewart. The Palm Beach Post, 40 miles to the south, had a correspondent. The paper in Fort Pierce, 20 miles to the north, had a correspondent there. The Stewart News is still there, now part of Gannett's USA Today network of Treasure Coast papers that includes Fort Pierce. And the rest have disappeared from the scene, even as Stewart has grown to a population of about 17,000, and the county has grown to 160,000. Now, Stewart is fortunate to have news coverage, especially when you consider that many communities have none. An estimated 1,300 communities have lost news coverage altogether, becoming what are called news deserts. There's a lot of discussion these days about the crisis in American journalism. Our business and profession face so many supposed crises, it can be hard to keep track. But arguably, the most severe crisis is at the local level, and we really should be focusing on that. If there is a media outlet covering local news, there's a good chance it doesn't have enough people to cover the city council or county commission or courts or cops or school boards or local planning agencies. And beyond local government, there is a dearth of coverage of state government. In many states, the largest newspaper may have only one or two people in the state capitol, responsible for covering the governor, both houses of the state legislature, all the state agencies, the policies, and the politics. In their spare time, they're supposed to do investigative reporting, holding government officials accountable. Now, in 21 states, according to the last count I saw, no local paper has a reporter in DC covering their congressional delegation and federal issues that affect citizens of that state. Despite the severe crisis in local journalism, there are also some promising signs of reinvention and innovation. And thankfully, there's some strong investigative reporting, which deserves our universal admiration and gratitude. Democracy needs that reporting to hold local and state government officials, as well as other interests, accountable. We'll hear about that today, in addition to hearing about the challenges. I'm proud to be a board member of the Knight Foundation, the presenting sponsor of today's gathering, which has dramatically increased its support for local news. And now I want to encourage you to watch this video from Knight, and we'll then turn the program over to my friend Jennifer Preston, Knight Foundation's pioneering and hugely energetic Vice President of Journalism. I expect she'll fill you in on the Foundation's new initiatives. Thank you, and enjoy the day.
There's nothing so powerful as what is authentically local, what really comes up out of the community, out of their hearts, out of their minds, their souls, and is natural for that place. There's no point in insisting that we have to run newspapers. The important thing is the news. It's not the paper. The important thing is getting the information into the minds of the people so they can determine what they want. bringing neighbors, bringing citizens together in their community in ways that they can understand about issues that are real issues for them. We're engaged now in doubling the amount of investment that we were planning to make over the next 5 years in trust, media, and democracy. Our journalism program evolved from traditional training of journalists to a focus on what are some new ideas to a major new initiative that actually seeks to stand up local news operations. That means we're going to invest some $300 million to drive local information into the hands of citizens who will come together and do with it what they will. That's pure night.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We are so thrilled to be here with you today to talk about building a future for local news. As Alberto and Marty emphasized, the crisis in journalism is local. So many people around the country can no longer depend on getting local, reliable news and information. Most of the reporting jobs lost in the last decade did not vanish here in Washington, except for, as Marty noted, regional reporters who could take news about Washington back to the cities and towns across the country, nor did they vanish in New York City. They disappeared across the country in both urban and rural areas, and there is no amount of curation, aggregation, short videos, social media posts that can or will replace original reporting on the ground. At night, we believe local news is a problem that can be solved. And as Marty mentioned, we have seen so many hopeful signs. The Documenters Project in Chicago, the Lenfest Institute in Philadelphia, and most recently, the Colorado Media Project in Denver, where local funders, journalists, public media, and the Associated Press are coming together to figure out how to more effectively serve the people of Colorado. With this initiative, we're working with scalable organizations and local leaders on the ground to create a new infrastructure for local news. These investments in Report for America, ProPublica, the News Literacy Project, the Solutions Journalism Network, the Revenue News Hub, the Institute for Not-for-Profit News are just the beginning of many, many investments to come that will help achieve these goals. Put more local reporters on the ground, expand legal assistance for local journalists through a new $10 million investment with the Reporters Committee for a Free Press, deliver the capital, the technology and business expertise that nonprofit journalism and local news startups need to succeed. We are thrilled that you are going to meet John Thornton today, who with Elizabeth Green, co-founder of Chalkbeat, have created the American Journalism Project, which I think is one of the most exciting developments on the journalism stage. These investments will also help local news leaders accelerate the transformation of their legacy organizations, newspapers and local TV and public media. And they will also help journalists do a better job listening in their communities and focus on better serving diverse and underserved communities and finally, we must address the long-standing problem of a lack of diversity in our news organizations and the failure of news outlets having people on staff who reflect the communities they serve. This investment will also support the technology that journalists need and fail to adapt quickly enough to meet consumers where they are and embrace new approaches to local journalism, such as the successful collaborative reporting projects we've seen around the country. A key goal for this initiative is to engage all of you and to enlarge the overall pie of not just philanthropic support for local journalism, but support from civic leaders, corporate leaders, for people to understand the value and importance of local journalism for our democracy. With enough support from all of you, we believe that this initiative, that this effort can be transformative. And please go to kf.org to learn more about the projects underway at kf.org, local news. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're just so delighted to have this conversation with you today.
I guess since the lights are up, I should start talking. We should get this underway. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer here at the Washington Post. And let me just get underway and introduce my guest. Sarah Lomax-Reese is president and CEO of WURD Radio, Pennsylvania's only African-American-owned talk station in Philadelphia, right?
Yes.
Audrey Cooper, editor-in-chief of the San Francisco Chronicle, and veteran television journalist Greta Van Susteren, who is the chief national political analyst for Gray TV, and you don't remember this, the second person to ever put me on television.
Who's the first?
Geraldo Rivera. Okay.
This is going well.
Yes, no, this is going to be great.
So you traded up.
Right.
No, I
Today,
love Geraldo.
as you see, we have three thought leaders here in journalism with different approaches to revitalizing and protecting local news. And as a reminder to our audience here and watching live stream, you can tweet questions to us this morning using the hashtag #PostLive. So Audrey, let me start with you. 8 years ago, the San Francisco Chronicle was in big, big trouble. It was reportedly bleeding $50 million a year at one point. You took over as editor-in-chief in 2015. Today, the paper is profitable and thriving. What changed?
Awesome leadership.
I should point out that Audrey is also, you're the first female editor-in-chief of the San Francisco Chronicle.
Yes.
Put that out there.
Well, a lot of things changed. First of all, we have a pretty diverse company. We have a lot of companies within the Chronicle. We have two different websites, one that I oversee for our subscribers, sfchronicle.com. We also have a free, little bit buzzier entertainment-y website called SFGate. And more importantly, though, we have a really good relationship with our subscribers, I think. We haven't cut our newsroom. We've reinvested in it. We've reinvested in our investigative team. And I think at the end of the day, we do a better job now than we ever have about talking about the journalism we do, why we do it, how we do it. And that transparency has really paid off for our readers.
And so then this idea that people don't want to pay for news, you've dispelled that myth.
Well, I mean, if more people want to pay me for news, I'm not going to turn it away. I think one of the things that if it doesn't come out in this morning will be a real problem is that we might be doing well now. The Chronicle has always been a little bit different. We were losing money when everybody else was making money. Now we're on the upswing. San Francisco is a little different than the rest of the country. I don't know if you all know that on the East Coast. But what I'm afraid of is not right now, it's the next recession, which is going to hit us. It's going to hit everybody in local journalism unless we can really get across to people that news is not free anymore. We've trained generations of Americans to think news is free, and this model is not going to work anymore. So we really need to all be together, I think, to articulate that to people.
Now, Greta, at Gray TV, you're doubling down on local news. Why?
Well, first of all, I have a rather complicated history in cable news. I think I've been to all of them now. Because, look, I know the importance of local news. And I had many wonderful years at cable news, but it really, for me, at least as a viewer, I know what everyone's going to say on cable news before I turn it on. You know, you give me the topic and I know, so I'm not really getting news. And I also think because of the money issue, and I'm in broadcast, and that is free, I regret to say that is free, is that I think that you can reach people. And just think about it. In the 2020 race, there are 3 gray TV stations in the state of Iowa. And who do you think the candidates are going to want to talk to? The people who broadcast free throughout the state of Iowa, or do they want to talk to cable where people may not even be able to afford to have a cable? The voters, you know, all the voters in Iowa can actually watch me. And I can reach Alaska, I can reach Hawaii through the whole gray network. Now, I do have an answer for you on the free thing, though, if I may.
Sure, go right ahead.
I still don't understand, because I think local news is so important. You learn about your factories, you learn about the school, you learn about student board, everything at the local level. Well, I think that the news industry should do much like Major League Baseball and go to Capitol Hill and get an exemption from the antitrust collusion and figure out a way so that you can have, you know, so that you have people paying for news. But, you know, you don't want to, San Francisco Chronicle can't charge people if the Washington Post is not going to, because people are going to go to the Washington Post. But even on the local level too, is if you just figure out, you know, because news is so important, is be allowed to collude on pricing, reasonable pricing, so that so that people will pay for news.
Sarah, at WURD, you innovated by expanding original programming, doing more community events, growing the digital platform for your station. Can you talk to us about the ways that you've innovated the company in the last 10 years?
Sure. My father purchased WURD in 2003, and I took over in 2010, so it's been about almost 10 years. Mm-hmm. And I inherited a station that was an AM independent station that was underperforming, basically. It was not self-sustaining at all. And so I really looked at it and tried to think about how could we reimagine what black talk radio could look like in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is about 45% African American. It's the poorest big city in the country, and has a very high poverty rate. And so there are a lot of opportunities for creating connections and information connections. So we really looked at how we could take a very multimedia approach, and we do a lot of events. We do over 100 events a year. We expanded to the FM dial, so we broadcast on AM and FM starting in 2017. We do a lot of partnerships. So we look at where our listeners are, and we partner with those organizations or institutions that serve our listeners. So we do a lot of partnerships with a supermarket that serves Black communities in Philadelphia. So we do in-store and lots of innovative things. We partner with other media. We partner with cultural institutions. But, as a small independent-owned company in a major market where there's lots of competition, it's like, innovate or die. You either figure out how you recreate yourself, or you go out of business. And so that's, we just launched a collaborative with 2 other African-American owned radio stations, WVON in Chicago and KJLH in LA, as a way to see how we can, as independently owned Black stations, create some support for each other, whether it's shared content or advertising or different ways to reimagine the business model as well, because all of us are struggling with the same issues. How do we diversify our audiences? How do we create sustainable business models?
Well, Sarah, let me pick up on something that you said as you were talking about how you're doing lots of events and partnerships and sponsorships. Doing these events, I can imagine, takes time. And it takes time to get these things to catch on. And I'm just wondering, how much patience does it require to innovate in a world where people want, business people, I imagine, want results and answers immediately? But it sounds to me like all the things that you're doing do require a long lead time before you see any success. Or am I getting this wrong?
I think it's both end, because you do need patience, because all of this stuff takes time to gain traction. But there's this concept of test and learn, and so we test a lot. So I'm a little bit of like a cat on a hot tin roof. I'm like always trying to figure stuff out, because in reality, Small businesses like ours don't have a long lead time. You know, we are fighting tooth and nail every day to make sure that we have another day to fight. So it's trying to plan for the future, but also realizing that there's an urgency around figuring stuff out in the here and now.
Greta, you mentioned before you've worked at all of them, all of the cable networks, and you've hit them on their lack of diversity in their ranks. How would supporting local news help diversity?
Well,
in your mind?
I mean, I think cable's in real trouble. I mean, because of the fact that it's expensive, but I think that the American people are getting pretty dissatisfied because they are not particularly enterprising. And I had a wonderful time. There are a lot of great people there. I don't mean to demean it, but they're not particularly enterprising. You know where they get their stories? They read like the San Francisco Chronicle, and they say, "Oh, look, the San Francisco Chronicle," and then they call up and do that. I mean, so you know, the money. You know, I feel sorry for the news, the print part of this, because you know, they provide a service to at least a cable. I don't know, you know, about broadcast in general. But I think that the problem is that cable is in trouble because they're not enterprising enough. But local is much more enterprising, and that's what I mean. That's what's under threat. You know, that's what's is horribly under threat. And I think cable eventually will sort of fade away as people don't want to pay for it, and as more people drop off and pay for it, there's going to be less advertising dollars, so they're much more in trouble. But the question is, how do you shore up local news? How do you make people realize that local news is so important?
Well, I'm thinking in terms of local news helping diversity in that you get a pool of talent. It's like a farm team that then could come up.
Diversity of employees or diversity of topics? Which? Are you talking about diversity of employees?
Yes.
How do you get them? Well, the news organizations hire them, and they make sure they get the stories. They make sure that they're enterprising and get the stories, and they become well known, and their bylines. They give them good editors, like they give good editors to everybody else, and they make sure their stories are fact checked and edited correctly. So I mean, it comes from the ground up. I mean, it's management that does that, I assume.
Audrey?
Yeah, I mean, we have, I would guess, at one point we had probably more Muslim American reporters than any other newsroom, and because of that we did stories on the Muslim community that we would have never gotten any other way. And you know, the transgender community and the Black community in town, and these issues are so inextricably linked to everything that's happening in the Bay Area and San Francisco, that to not have people reporting on their community and to not have people see themselves reflected in bylines is irresponsible. It's crappy journalism too.
But doesn't that start? I mean, I assume that not to pick on management. Management makes those decisions pretty much on what stories are covered and who gets sent where and who gets hired, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a problem in this country where most leadership is white and male. I mean, that's just, and you tend to hire people who look like you. It's just a fact. So it takes a lot of effort.
All right, Sarah, you've written and talked about diversity in the media. Have at it.
Yeah, so, you know, I have a lot of issues with this this question around diversifying newsrooms. You know, 1968, the Kerner Commission report came out and identified that part of the challenge and the reason that the country was so racially stratified was because the media was not reflective of the country. 50 years later, now 51 years later, the newsrooms are still not diversified and are still not reflective of the communities. I, as an owner operator, I really struggle with this notion that we do have to diversify newsrooms, but we also have to diversify ownership. I really believe that ownership matters, and there's a certain kind of agency and independence that comes with ownership, and that's never part of the diversity conversation. And I think that it needs to be, because, again, 50 years we've been struggling with how do we have full representation of the diversity that's reflected in our communities, which is becoming more and more diverse.
But you know, the problem with that, at least in the electronic area and TV, is that there are these huge conglomerates that are gobbling up all these things. I mean, you know, the small businesses really get hurt. You know, the small journalism organizations, they're disappearing as, you know, AT&T buys CNN or somebody else. I mean, that's a whole nother issue about how, the money. And of course, then when the big news organizations, they are publicly held corporations with fiduciary duties to their shareholders, and they worry about their quarterly reports. So what do? Do you keep all your reporters in a studio to talk about President Trump's tweet, or do you send them out to the community to talk about a factory that's going under? Well, you keep them here, it's cheap, so that you're not spending the money, so your shareholders are happy, but your content really isn't consistent with what your obligation is, and frankly, an obligation that's set forth in the Constitution about the free press. So I mean, there are a lot of complicated issues, and it's around money.
Yes.
Go ahead, if you want to respond, but
Well,
I have a follow-up for you.
I think that, and I know that there are going to be some additional conversations later today about kind of regulations and legal and policy that can be enacted to create a more level playing field. But I think that there are policies that were enacted that created the kind of, corporatization of media that we see now. The 1996 Telecommunications Act under President Clinton was really transformed the radio industry in very detrimental ways for independent operators. So I think that there's a policy role. I think that there's a role for the nonprofit world. I think that all of these things need to be looked at very carefully in terms of how do you empower and really make sure, however you do it, that diverse voices are a part of the mix.
And if they have money at the local level, that will have a better opportunity than if you squeeze them out. And that we go back to almost like, how do we make sure that the local level is making money so that it can thrive, it can be diverse or be whatever?
Yeah.
Well, we have members of Congress who might be here right now or probably watching. Sarah, if you had an opportunity to give them an idea of what to do to diversify ownership, what would you tell them? Is there something you have in mind that they could do?
I mean, and I'm not sure like the specific mechanisms for this, but the bottom line is access to capital has always been the barrier for ownership and growth and expansion. And so to the extent that there are, whether it's tax credits or if there are ways to create a much more a better environment to either invest or to fund or to support these kinds of organizations, I think that would be one direction.
We have a question from Twitter from Corey, who asks, local news is especially important in rural areas like my home in Tennessee. Those outlets are typically run by an older generation. How can we get younger people more involved in local news and their perspective on issues? Who wants to take that?
Keyboard, Twitter, local news, everything. I mean, they'll have to step up a little bit themselves, and make the jobs available. You're never going to get a cable to do cable service in there because it's too expensive to do it. I mean, not that cable's going to necessarily give it to you, but get Wi-Fi into these areas so that they can engage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, we're actually working intentionally to reach out to a younger demographic now, the 18 to 35-year-old demographic. And I think, one, you have to have intentionality around it, and you also have to engage them and find out what's of interest to them. What do they want to know about? What do they, and have them meet them in the platforms that they operate in, social media and things like that, and engage them around creating content that you will then amplify. So I think user-generated content and just making sure that their issues, their concerns, their values are reflected through their lens. And I think that you really have to engage them in authentic ways in order to connect with them authentically.
Audrey, as we all know, trust in news is at an all-time low. But apparently, the good news is that local outlets are named as the most trusted source of news for Americans. And I would actually like all of you to chime in on this. How do you feel about the current state of media in the United States?
Oh, gosh, we
Simple
don't have enough
topic
time
in 8
for that. Well, I think with all due respect to my colleague.
Uh-oh, I'm getting a hand.
There we go.
But I think when people think of media, that's like that's a big thing.
Right.
And what I do is really different even from what you do here at the Post, and we're like printing a newspaper and doing a website thing. And I think cable news deserves a lot of the credit for this because the discourse has become more about the content of the questions than the answers that you're getting. The question presupposes an answer a lot of the times, I think. And we are on the ground and we're talking to a local community and hopefully innovating and doing things that are what our audience wants to know about. So I think, media in general is kind of a big question. My concern right now, I've gotten 5 emails in the last 24 hours from people who said, I can't log into your app. If the Washington Post can get it together, why can't you? And or the New York Times. And we have done such a poor job of explaining the news organizations that are really thriving are the ones that have national scale, because you can get people and advertisers from the entire country. I have 8 million people, and some of them are kids that I'm looking to get. So it's a completely different scale model.
What's interesting, though, is that, first of all, I think there's going to be greater discontent with the national. I mean, it appears that national media can oftentimes be an echo chamber. When Governor Romney chose Speaker Ryan, not then Speaker Ryan, as running mate, I can't tell you how many national news organizations described it as a bold choice. And I thought, what are the odds? Everyone comes up with the same word. What are the odds? And what's different about local, and this is true even of a national newspaper like the San Francisco Chronicle, is you live where you're reporting, and that makes a big difference, because naturally, if you're in Iowa, and with 2020 I've got my attention on Iowa, is who are you going to think understands Iowa better? The local gray anchor or correspondent, or someone who sort of parachutes in from a national news organization for 2 hours and leaves? So naturally, you're going to trust, the local person understands the issues more. San Francisco Chronicle, understands San Francisco, and also they do national and international, but at least they sort of live in the area. And I think that makes a big difference on the trust.
Mm-hmm. Sarah?
I think that there's so much coming at us all the time on so many different fronts. You've got social media, you've got 24-hour news channels, you've got podcasts, you've got terrestrial radio. You've got the mix is just overwhelming, and I think that the media, I guess fortunately or unfortunately, you have to kind of exist in all of these spaces now to be relevant. But I think that one of the things that is an important aspect is the human connection, and I think that's what's unique about the local media landscape, is that you can not just talk about an issue, but you can engage with people and provide them and connect them with information and resources and something that's actionable that can really impact and change their lives. And so to me, that's really what is exciting about the media from my standpoint, is how can we use all of these platforms, whatever we're doing, to really affect change and really empower people. And I think that the media is, at its best, that's what it does. Mm-hmm. At its worst, it confuses and distracts and pisses people off.
But the trust factor, knowing the people, helps so much that they live in the community. I'm from Appleton, Wisconsin, a small community. I had lunch with a friend of mine about a couple years ago, and when we were leaving, I said, "You need a ride?" He said, "You drive your own car?" And I said, "Well, what do you think I did?" I don't think that in the national media people realize we go to the grocery store. We go to the dry cleaners, and I think that there's such a disconnect. So why would you trust somebody who seems to have a different life than your own? And I think that's what the beauty of is when you live in your community that you report about. And that's why I think local is trusted so much, is because it seems like it could be your next door neighbor.
In the 3 minutes that we have left, Audrey, I have to ask you this question. Since you are in the Bay Area, so she's already smiling, she knows where I'm going. You're in Silicon Valley, and so many of the tech companies that are Facebook, Google, Apple, they've all attempted to launch news partnerships. And these are the same tech companies that have helped create the news deserts that we're going to be talking about today. And they're grabbing all the advertising dollars and they're placing content without paying for it inside their own platform. So what do you think about Mark Zuckerberg just saying recently that Facebook may pay for content?
Well, okay. I mean,
As long as he pays the Chronicle, right?
I've been. There are a lot of great people who work at Facebook, and they are our readers and my neighbors. Mark Zuckerberg is my neighbor.
Like next door neighbor?
Well, like pretty close, like a couple blocks away. We like stroller bump at Dolores Park. And I've been extremely critical of Facebook and how they've handled news. Our Facebook referrals last year dropped by 80%. When they decided that news makes you cranky and they didn't want that on their news feed anymore. It's starting to go back up. And I just think what Facebook has done is changed how people consume news. And so if they want to pay us, fine. But what I would really appreciate is stopping what I think is disingenuous appreciation of local news, really, from Facebook, because they trained people to use their product because people were opting in to get my news. That's how they wanted to receive it, because it was convenient. And then to throw up our arms and say, well, this is hard. Gosh, Russians. Gosh, white supremacists is, I think, intellectually lazy and has done more to hurt this country than probably anything else in media over the last generation.
The last question is for all of you in the minute and 12 seconds that we have left. I'll start with you, Sarah. What makes you all hopeful about the future of local news? Sarah.
I think the ability to directly impact people in a profound and consistent, sustainable way that can really change and benefit people's lives.
I would say, I tell our newsroom, our job is to earn new readers and save the world. And I am not going to be the last editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. I can damn near guarantee that. And it's incumbent for us all in the industry to do a better job evangelizing what we do and how we save the world every day.
And I appreciate Washington Post, Knight Foundation putting attention on it. I think it takes attention to have things get better.
Sarah Lomax Reese, Audrey Cooper, Greta Van Susteren, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
And please stay tuned for the next part of our program. We're going to walk off, and I'm going to come back with two members of Congress. Okay, time for panel two. Again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer here at the Washington Post. And I'm joined by, as I randomly said, two members of Congress, but these are two important members of Congress who are members of the House Judiciary Committee. Congressman Doug Collins of Georgia is a Republican, and he is the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee. And sitting right next to me is Congressman David Cicilline. He is a Democrat and from Rhode Island, sorry, Congressman, and the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Antitrust, Commercial, and Administrative Law. Congressman, thank you very much for being here.
Glad to be here.
It was announced this week that you're both co-sponsoring a piece of legislation called the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. Why are you joining forces on this issue, and what exactly are you trying to accomplish?
Well, this legislation, and I'm very proud to be doing it with my friend and colleague Doug Collins, will create a safe harbor, really an opportunity for local journalists, online publishers to band together for purposes of negotiating with the two large technology platforms. It grows out of a recognition that we need to do something to give local media, local news publishers, the ability to survive. You know, that we've seen a significant decline over the last decade of about 45% of the jobs in the newspaper industry. over the last year, Facebook and Google have generated revenues of about $60 billion. Over the last several years, the revenues for news publishers is down about 31 billion. So you're seeing this shift of all of the revenue, or a big part of the revenue, to these two large technology platforms, and they occupy such a big dominant place in the marketplace that they essentially dictate to local news publishers and content producers the terms of using their content in a way that is making it impossible for them to survive. So this bill will essentially say, for a limited period of time, we're going to authorize you to work together to level the playing field so you can negotiate in a way that allows you to survive.
Well, I think the biggest thing is it goes back to what we do here in Washington. That's actually, there is legislation that goes on, and that's sort of crazy. If you watch the Judiciary Committee, that doesn't always happen. I'm not typically this quiet and serene, as you could well take, but when we find this areas of opportunity for legislation, I did this in the last Congress with criminal justice reform, with Music Modernization Act. What this actually does, though, is gives a fairness issue. You know, from my perspective, I'm not worried about, big being bad. That's not a process for me. Facebook, Google, these are great disruptive platforms that have been there and changed really the way a lot of us get our content and our news. But the question is, how in that disruption did we take what was existing, and has it made it unfair, or is it at least less competitive for those that don't have that access, but could, if we gave them an antitrust exemption, if we gave them that ability? Because for me, I serve Northeast Georgia, which is right on the edge of Atlanta, so we have a little bit of suburban, but we go into the mountains, which is very rural. And most of my counties, if they have a paper, they have one, or it's usually owned by several. And we've seen just a 20% decline in newspapers over the last 10 to 15 years. And when you talk about that, you're looking at the dearth of news, or a news desert, if you would.
Right.
So this is something we're trying to look at and fix, and I appreciate the opportunity to partner.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the phrase news desert, because I was going to ask you, how has this affected the people in your district? Is it something that is so concerning that you have people in your district calling up and saying, do something about this?
Necessarily calling up, I think this is what makes it interesting for the bill. They don't necessarily call up because there's been a transition, but what we are finding is local advertisers, local businesses and stuff who depend on that local newspaper. I love being a congressman from a very rural district, because I can go into like one of my counties and open the local paper. Not only do I see who's preaching revival this week and who died, but I can also see the local businesses. This is where it's became real for them to stay in business, is not skimming that news, where they can get that actual local content instead of it just being who gets the scores on the weekend. And I talked to one of my local publishers just the other day about this, and he said that they've had to adapt. They're doing that. But I have a real practical thing. My father and I won't name the publications, but what he found is he was getting two newspapers every day. He finally went down to one. He chose the local one over the one that he was getting, because basically the local was just taking some of the same articles from the other one, but he was at least getting that local content. So that's where it means a lot to people.
But I also think people are seeing examples of it in newspapers all over the country when they see massive layoffs or newspapers that are closing. I mean, the Providence Journal, which is the newspaper in my home state, is a fraction of the size it was at one time, and it's because they're trying to compete in this market that's not working. And I think what is so alarming to folks is this is not just kind of the sale of widgets. Like if the market doesn't work and widgets don't exist or not as good as price, this is about access to reliable, trustworthy information that is essential to a functioning democracy, to hold local government and to state government and national government accountable, to hold power to account, to expose corruption. I mean, all the things that the media does so importantly is threatened by this marketplace, which is not functioning properly, with real consequences, not just, again, a commercial sale of a widget, but like the survival of our democracy.
Well, Congressman Cicilline, this month you wrote a letter to the Federal Trade Commission asking that they open an investigation into whether Facebook has broken antitrust laws. Can you lay out your case this morning and why it would be a good thing for local news, for the local news landscape in the country?
Well, I think there's no question that Facebook has violated a number of their legal obligations with the consent decrees. They've engaged in discriminatory practices that favor their platform. They've not protected the privacy of consumers that use their platform. They've shared or allowed to be shared personal data that was under their control, that ought to have been under the control of the consumer. Part of this is because they control such a dominant place in the market. And if you think about in the context of the news media, about 2/3 of Americans get their news through two platforms, Facebook and Google. So they have enormous power in the marketplace as real gatekeepers to information. So I think we've got to look at the antitrust implications of that. Do our antitrust statutes work today in the way they were designed? I mean, they were written mostly during the railroad monopolies, a very different economy. So I think this is a moment to do a top to bottom examination of, do we need to update and modernize our statutes so that we really are creating an environment for good competition that drives down cost, creates more choices, sparks innovation? And I think we're seeing just the opposite with a lot of Facebook's behavior.
Well, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, also a candidate for president in 2020, said that she wants to break up the tech companies. Is this what you're gunning for?
No, I mean, I think it's too early to say that. I think there's a lot we can be doing to create competition-based solutions to deal with the size of these platforms. I do think we have to look at some of the acquisitions they've made. It sort of is a practice when they see a competitor, they buy them up and crush them or incorporate them. So I think we ought to be looking at some of those things. But I think we have a lot we can do to put in place good regulations that will promote competition, get the markets to work. I think that we ought to do that first.
What do you think, Congressman?
I think it's a running for president overreaction, in all fairness. If you broke up these Google or Facebook, what are you breaking up? We're not going back to the old days. Well, the East Coast will take these 100 trains, the West Coast will take these 100 trains, and you're having separate companies, or even the baby bells, if you want to go back to that. You're taking intellectual property and trying to figure out how that would then work out. Look, I want to make it very clear. I do not believe Facebook or Google or any of these larger Twitter or others to be evil. In fact, I think they're a great thing that has happened. The question is, how do we take our economy as it exists, and how do we now blend those in such a predominance that 10 years ago we would not be sitting in this stage talking about this. This is such an interesting phenomenon. That's why this bill for me was a first step to say, let's see if we can bring fairness, and especially to our smaller, our local papers, our regional papers, to say, let's at least give them the ability to band together so that they can work to get paid and get their ad revenues from their content, which I value greatly. Intellectual property is something we don't talk enough about, frankly, in our Judiciary Committee, because that is our economy. That is the basis of our new thoughts, that we got our Googles and our Facebooks and our Twitters and our local papers and our national papers. So this is, for me, is saying, how do we do this without going in and saying just because they're big, they're bad? In fact, I reject that. I simply say, how can we look at the economy to scale and make sure that there's a fair playing field through antitrust?
Yeah, I would just disagree slightly. I do think we have to acknowledge some of the behavior of these large platforms, particularly Facebook, is actually bad. They violated legal obligations and consent decrees and all the other things I've already mentioned. So I do think the newspaper bill is an opportunity to address one issue as it relates to news and the production of news and protecting the ability of diverse local media to thrive and exist, which is essential to our democracy. But it's a symptom of a much larger problem, and that is this tremendous concentration of economic power in these large platforms, and tremendous concentrations of economic power in other areas. That is a broad antitrust challenge, and I think we have a lot of work to do to take that on in a serious way. It ought to be bipartisan. I think it will be, because I think people understand competition and choice and innovation are important to our economy, and these concentrations of economic power have often resulted in tremendous concentrations of political power, which makes change in this space sometimes difficult.
Which that last comment is really interesting, especially from our perspective, a conservative perspective in regard to this, which has been a lot of discussion lately. But I think the interesting thing is we're on two separate trains, and David and I are not on different trains here. I believe that there's privacy issues and other things. That's another discussion on another day. What we're looking at here, and if there are issues among any institution is holding a lot of data and how they're selling that, because that's what they're marketing. That's their value. Mm-hmm. Their value is not what they give you on your search. What they value is how they're able to sell to advertisers what you are putting in there on what you do. So those are two different issues. I agree we need to look at that. I'm not turning a blind eye to things that we would look at, but this gives us a chance to look at the marketplace itself for free enterprise and for marketplace for our local news so that we can have an informed electorate.
Mm-hmm. Let me get your reaction to something that Mark Zuckerberg wrote in an op-ed for the Washington Post this week. In it, he calls for more regulation of the internet and hones in on 4 areas: harmful content, election integrity, privacy, and data portability. Do you think this is an attempt to take control and steamroll the process, getting ahead of you in Congress regulating him/them, Facebook, and members, tech companies?
Well, from my perspective, I think it's a little rich to have Mark Zuckerberg try to give us advice about how Facebook ought to be regulated, because everything he suggested, lots of other folks have suggested in stronger terms much long ago. And the reality is Facebook has demonstrated unequivocally that it is not capable of regulating itself. It has been a bad actor in some very fundamental ways. And while I appreciate that Mr. Zuckerberg is sort of aware of the growing sentiment across the country that Facebook needs to be held accountable and needs to be regulated in a way that protects data privacy, that empowers people to actually have control over their own data, that prevents that platform being used to kind of promote false information and interfere with our democratic institutions. It's good he acknowledges kind of the sentiment out there, but I do not expect that we're going to rely on Mr. Zuckerberg to put together the proposals to regulate himself.
Well, I mean, is it not a good thing that Zuckerberg recognizes that
it'd be a better thing if
have to be regulated?
It'd be a better thing if his company behaved differently. I'm grateful he's writing nice op-eds, but I think this is a serious problem that requires serious congressional attention. We're going to do it, and I think we'll encourage the industry to be part of the conversation and help us develop the best solutions, but it's going to be done by the Congress and not by Mr. Zuckerberg, by his past conduct.
Yeah. Well, I think that, and playing off of that, I think, though, but we look at this, and again, we got to be careful here. We build straw men to tear down. And I think when we understand this, you have the problems and you have this, which many of us have looked at and say, how do you affect this in the economy? But what I'm very fearful of, and for many of us here today, and we talked about this when we did music modernization, we've done this, is we've got to make sure that we're not fixing our itch right this second. Too many times in Congress, we go down this path of let's run to the floor with both Democrats and Republicans. Let's fix the itch that we see right now without looking at what does it look like 5, 10 years down the line. And if we understand this, I'm glad that they're coming to the table. I've had my issues with them on content piracy, everything. These are all discussions that need to be had. These are not small startups anymore. These are dominant players in the marketplace. They make billions of dollars. They make a lot of money. They have a lot of good lawyers. They understand this. Them coming to the table in this process is good, but if we simply scratch the itch that makes us feel good right now, we're going to miss the bigger picture, and then we're going to be dealing with more problems down the line.
All right, let's go to another punching bag. Let's leave Mark Zuckerberg aside and go to the committee that you're on, the House Judiciary Committee. I would be negligent if I did not ask you.
Journalistically negligent.
Yes. If not asking you about the Mueller report.
Our Kumbaya committee.
Yeah, exactly. So your committee voted yesterday to authorize subpoenas to get the Mueller report, the full report. What comes next? And how far, Congressman Cicilline, how far are the Democrats willing to go on this? And Congressman Collins, how far will Republicans go to stop it? I'll start with you, Congressman.
Well, look, this is an effort by the Democrats to get the contents of the full Mueller report. We argued yesterday that this has been the practice, whether it was in the Jaworski scenario or in the Ken Starr report, whether it was independent counsel or special counsel. The Starr report was delivered immediately upon its completion to Congress, along with 17 boxes of documents that supported the contents of that report. Congress wasn't required to ask for it. They went to court to get the authority for the grand jury testimony, and it was produced. This is an investigation which was begun because our democracy was attacked by a foreign adversary. It's an investigation which was begun on behalf of the American people, paid for by the American people. We have fought hard to protect Mr. Mueller so he could complete his work. We have a right as Congress to see the full contents of that report immediately, and the American people have a right to see as much of it as humanly possible, obviously redacting what has to be redacted for sources and methods and classified material. But we see classified documents all the time. We can go do that in a classified setting and see it. We are the body that's responsible for taking action if there's misconduct by the president, not the Attorney General. And so this report, the Democrats on the committee are prepared to We issued, authorized the chairman to issue a subpoena to compel its production. We're hopeful the Attorney General will reconsider his view and turn it over quickly. If he doesn't, we're prepared to execute the subpoena and compel production of the report. The American people deserve to know the truth, to know all the facts, and to recognize that Congress understands no one is above the law.
Congressman Collins, I want to get your reaction to what Congressman Cicilline said, but I want to ask you to respond in that. Do you think Special Counsel Mueller should be called up to the Hill to testify?
I think at some point that'll probably be the case that happens. I think here's the interesting thing. What we did yesterday was, again, a preemptive issue before we went out of town. This is an issue that Bill Barr has said, I'm going to release the report under the regulations that he has. We keep conflating these issues. Go back to Jaworski, go back to Starr. Those were two different issues under two different set out statements as you go forward. The Mueller report will come out, whether you like it or not, is going to come out, and it's going to come out under the regulations set forth not by Republicans, but by Janet Reno, Justice Department, when she, after the Starr report, said, we don't like the way this happened. In fact, my chairman actually during that time said he didn't like the way it happened. So they put this together. He's done everything by that regulatory book. My question is and what I would have said yesterday was, it's interesting. We took the Mueller report and saying, Bill Barr, we want this information to come. I agree with Mr. Cicilline's very measured discussion right here about what he wanted to see, but we've had my chairman and others who say we just want to see it all unredacted. That's a whole different issue, which is what we didn't vote on 2 weeks ago, even on the floor. But what we have to understand is coming forward, get this report. After you get the report, then you say, if you don't like it, then come to the floor with subpoenas. Then come to the committee and say, we didn't get what we wanted. Let's put a subpoena out there and do it. What we're doing now is, before we ever get the report, we're asking for subpoena and put 5 individuals who have two of which have gave over 3,000 documents to the committee, 3 of which have said, we don't have the documents you're requesting. But so to me, you lost sort of your political high ground here, or moral ground here, when you didn't just stick with the Mueller report, which I thought was preemptive anyway, but then you added 5 people in who all had close connections to the president. That just simply tells me you wanted the press to report that we're going to issue subpoenas for 5 people close to the president before we go out of town for spring break to smear the president. That's the problem I had with yesterday.
Congressman Cicilline, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, look, this is not about smearing anybody. This is about finding the facts. We have a constitutional obligation to do oversight. This is about honoring the practice that has been on. The responsibility of the Judiciary Committee has not changed. We are the committee that has oversight responsibility. If Mr. Barr should have turned the report over already, we should have the full contents and all the supporting material, and then we can have a long discussion about what needs to be redacted or not released to the public because it protects sources and methods or another investigation. But the public has a right to know what's in that report.
And they're going
we ought to know that. And we shouldn't have to wait for Mr. Barr to give us the pieces that he wants to give us or a summary of his interpretation of it. We're grown men and women. We can do that ourselves. That's what we're going to let do.
You know what's amazing to me, though, is up until last weekend, Mr. Mueller's investigation was the most gold standard, and Bill Barr was a great man.
It still is, but no, Bill Barr was a great man. No one said Bill Barr was a great man. We all said we trust Mr. Mueller. We'd like to see his report. We've all been saying we can't make a decision until we know what the report says. We're still waiting for it.
So Bill Barr, the hand-picked puppet of the president, which has been out of the mouths of Democrats, Mr. Barr, who is the hand-picked and has won the integrity of question on the floor by Scott. Yeah. Give me a break.
I think that's right. I think, just to make clear, I think, Democrats have raised real concerns about Mr. Barr's writing a 17-page memo in which he argues no president can obstruct justice because they're in charge of the Justice Department, catches the attention of the president. They say, you're hired. Yeah. And lo and behold, he delivers. He says,
and the report said that. You're going to have the, and what?
But we're going to work together on the journalism bill.
We're good.
And with that, we'll leave it there. Congressman Collins, Congressman Cicilline, thank you very much.
Thanks
for having us.
Good morning. I'm Sarah Ellison. I'm a media reporter for The Washington Post, and I'm delighted to introduce my guest, Ann Kornblut. She is the Director of New Initiatives on the News Partnerships team at Facebook. She's also a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who spent nearly 2 decades in the news business, including at The Washington Post, before joining Facebook. So we're sort of happy to bring her back home a little bit. She is now leading a new initiative at the company aimed at granting $300 million over the next 3 years to news programs and content. And some of that's going towards local news. First, I just have to ask you about the previous panel. I wanted to get your response to Congressman Cicilline's notion of allowing a kind of antitrust loophole to allow news publishers to band together?
Thank you. Well, first, I want to say thank you. I know I'm here as the Facebook person, but I really, I feel still like a Washington Post person, so thanks for letting me come back. Yeah, it was really interesting to hear them, both of them, talk about their idea. I hadn't heard them do it live for such an extended period of time before. You know, I think the most important thing to know is that we share their goal, which is to have a viable news ecosystem where publishers, big ones, small ones, local, can survive and not be beholden to traffic from a particular platform or another. I know, and we're in touch with their offices. I know our team has some concerns about the specifics of this approach. And my understanding, although I'm not a lawyer, is that it has to do with what it has historically done for consumers when this kind of regulation has been approached. But in any case, I'll tell you about what we are focused on. Our focus, and my personal focus as someone who cares deeply about news, is on helping publishers figure out a business model for the future. And for ones that need to make certain transformations, trying to figure out how to help them do that, because we want them to be viable. And we're doing this, I know we're going to talk about this, but we're doing it in a number of ways that are both on the platform and off the platform, because I think we want to get to a place where they're able to survive, where they're able to have the kind of business model that's going to work. And for many, that's going to be subscriptions. We heard Audrey talking about that in the beginning. I know for the Post that has worked really well. That's where we want to get to, is a place that is really forward-looking and can be sustained for the long term.
Well, so let's talk about that. I mean, that's sort of what you're here to tell us. What is Facebook's approach to solving local news?
Look, I mean, and I will say, for me, the Washington Post is local news because I grew up here, and I read it and remember what it felt like to have local news when our high school, its academic team would be mentioned. That feeling of local news is so important. And it's important to me personally. I started at the New York Daily News, the Boston Globe, so I have a lot of local news I care about. It is important to Facebook. It's not just a little team that cares about news. Facebook's core mission is community and building community. And local news is one of the most important ways you can actually build community. We've seen people come together around local news in a way that I think it would be devastating if it were somehow lost. And the whole reason we're here is we know what peril it's in. It's also important for democracy. And as we've heard from the last panel, we have a responsibility, and we've increasingly worked on our investments in helping build a stronger democracy. But the last reason is it's an unmet need. And so, we just know we can be helpful. I can talk about some of the specifics of what we're doing, if that would be helpful.
Well, one of the things that I've noticed is that you aren't giving directly to publishers. You're not handing money to publishers. There's sort of a buffer layer. Why is that an unnecessary layer, or why are you doing it that way?
So, I mean, look, publishers of all kinds, including the Washington Post, can get subscribers on Facebook themselves. So that's part of what we do on the platform. And when they get subscribers on Facebook, they can keep 100% of the revenue. That's not the case for other, some other players in the industry, but we do it that way. Off the platform, we are making investments in places like Knight. Sue Preston was here earlier. Jen Preston was talking earlier about that. And the Pulitzer Center. The reason we're making an investment like the $5 million we gave to the Pulitzer Center that they are then giving to local news organizations to do investigative work and other kinds of stories is because they're the ones who are best positioned to decide who is going to do. These are nonprofits that are dedicating their lives to understanding the local news ecosystem. Who needs it? Who's going to do the work? Because ultimately, this is about getting the stories done right. I also don't think that it would be good for anybody if Facebook were giving direct money out to publishers. I think publishers would probably be concerned they'd be accused of not writing fair stories, and we know that we're a fair target for people to write about too. So we want to make sure that they can do that. But I would encourage everyone, the Pulitzer Center, if you go look at their website, some of the reporting they've already done this year is incredible. They helped sponsor a series in St. Louis and in Kentucky around police asset seizure. So when they take drug money, what do they do with it? Well, it turns out they're funding their own police department and in some cases buying sports cars. Okay, that's incredible local reporting. And I think, the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting, it was Pulitzer's idea to give them the money. I had no idea what work they were doing, but we're starting to see some of that work. And when we do, that's really what it's all about.
I want to talk a little bit about news deserts. We have a map that Facebook created that shows news deserts discovered as you rolled out your initiatives. So it's there in here.
Yeah.
So if you want to see, the green spaces indicate robust news presence and the white ones where there is little to none. When I talk to some of the publishers who are working with Facebook and others who are not the small ones, they say, this is like the arsonist coming to put out the fire, because Facebook and other platforms helped create that news desert. What do you say to that, and also what are you doing about these news deserts?
Look, I understand that question. I mean, I was in a local newsroom when the economics started to change. I was at the Boston Globe, and I've lived through. I mean, I've only been at Facebook 4 years. I've lived through a lot of that, although not always at a local. But I mean, Facebook understands that, and I think because we can't go backwards, the goal is to try to go forwards as we think about what we can do now with the economics of it. And so again, that's why I think our subscription tool is really important. It's a subscription tool within Instant Articles that lets publishers get subscribers. We've also been working on membership approaches. I know that you've had some people here earlier today talking about membership. Everyone's familiar with the NPR model of getting members. It turns out it's really viable for some very small and not so small local publishers too, because they find that they have this connection with their audience, the way Audrey was saying with the San Francisco Chronicle, and people want to give. And so how do we help them understand what to do to get that better?
Right.
And look, I'm not saying that there's a silver bullet or you just do memberships and everything is going to work out great. Not at all. But there are some small changes, and I can talk to you about what's working if you want, but there are some small changes that in working with our publishers who are part of what we call our accelerator program, they come together for a 3 to 6 month period where we bring them together with a coach and they get to do some training around a business challenge. The last one we did was around memberships. And so we helped some very interesting and small publishers learn how to do memberships better and see real improvements.
I talked to one of your partners in that, and they said they doubled their subscription or their membership retention or acquisition in 12 weeks.
Who was it?
there's
Which
definitely.
That's great.
Remember.
I love
Sorry.
that. Well, no, but there's
that's
some.
working.
There's
That's
one.
working
I mean,
part of it.
they mentioned the Cleveland Plain Dealer earlier, and so devastating, the layoffs. But we also worked in our membership accelerator with the Richland Source, which is a digital publication.
What it was.
Was it them?
Source. Yeah.
Okay, so they're now on track to triple their membership over the course of 2019, their membership revenue. And you know why? Because they learned how to ask people for money more than once. They were worried about being rude, like we all would, and saying, sending too many emails. But no, the first one, nobody answers reads the first email. So they tested sending multiple emails, and it turned out that that's how they can start to grow their membership. Tiny change, big impact, and it was all because they came together. They learned it from other publishers, and we were able to just pay for their travel and hire a coach and help facilitate that.
I want to talk to you about trust. When I talk to publishers, they say they can't trust Facebook because there are these examples of, in 2015, one of the most high-profile examples of this was there was a big pivot to video, and Mark Zuckerberg came out and said that the news feed was going to be primarily video. And you had contracts with publishers to create video content. I remember creating Facebook Live videos that were of dubious production and news value, I'm sure. But newsrooms poured tons of resources into that, and then Facebook decided to back away from that, and it was devastating. So when I talk to some of these local publishers, they say, what is Facebook's commitment? Will you still be here for local news next year, and how can we trust you?
I completely understand. It's a totally fair question, and I think I have such compassion for the news organizations. You know, again, I was in a newsroom for a while. I understand the ups and downs that this relationship has been through. I think what I'm seeing us do differently, I hope, is to just have a more candid relationship with publishers and to, frankly, be more realistic about the expectations that we all set when we have a conversation about what's going to happen, and just do a better job of setting expectations. You know.
So that would mean for something like on the video side, you would say, oh, it's halfway through the year, this isn't working, or we're finding the traffic. I mean, how do you do that actually?
Or saying, you know, instead of having a conversation that's all about referral traffic, which, you know, Audrey mentioned, that continues to go up and down, and probably will because the algorithm's not going to stay static. Having a conversation about like your core business challenge. We can talk about referral traffic, but are you trying to build a subscription base? Are you trying to get to know, are you trying to get to know your audience better?
Right.
Let's solve that so that you don't actually need Facebook as much. I think what we don't want is for organizations to be wholly dependent on Facebook or any platform. Want them to be sustainable. So doing a better job of having that conversation. One thing I will say is we have, and you talk to some of them, we've worked really hard on the relationship with local publishers, and I think that the trust there is good and can continue to grow. But look, there are going to be skeptics, and to the skeptics I would say, I hope we prove you wrong.
I mean, one of the things about just going back to news deserts, you guys came out with an announcement to say that your product or your efforts in local news weren't working because there wasn't enough content to use in your actual feed. So, I mean, is it partly that Facebook can't operate without this sort of content? Because there are people who say, I mean, Audrey did say, she is the editor-in-chief of the San Francisco Chronicle. She said that Facebook's interest in local news feels disingenuous. And cited that Facebook referrals dropped 80% last year. Right.
So let me unpack that just a little. The Today In product, it's really if you are in your news feed.
Today In was an effort to like.
The Today In is the product that was the genesis of the map you saw. It's a module that may show up in your newsfeed that would say Today in Bethesda, which is actually the one I first signed up for because I wanted to see what it was like back here. And it will show you the weather, and it'll show you it'll pull in algorithmically some of the local news from there. In the course of doing that research, we had tons of local news content, but we did then discover where there is none. So it's been very successful. It turns out people, as we are discussing today, people love local news. But in the course of doing it, we found all this data, and our product team that built it, this wonderful woman, Anthea Watson-Strong, said, why am I sitting on all this data? This isn't fair. Like, we need to share it with academics. And so we had to work out all the privacy considerations, and we shared it. But no, I think it's a misconception. It's been reported a little not quite right that we didn't have enough content. There is a lot of content. I think our goal is to figure out how that can continue to be even more beneficial to publishers.
I want to ask you, so Facebook doesn't pay publishers for news, but you pay for music and entertainment. Mark Zuckerberg just said in an interview earlier this week that he's considering paying publishers for their work and creating a sort of news tab, a walled off area for news. How close is that to becoming a reality? Is that in the works, or is it?
Well, thank you. Yeah, he just mentioned it over the weekend. I think we're all really excited about the prospect of being able to do it. It's going to require testing and building and all the things. You know, I think the reason for it is right now, if you want news in newsfeed, you have to wait for it. It shows up maybe because your friends and family recommend it, or maybe you follow a publisher's page. I mean, mine is all see first. I see first the Washington Post. But if you don't do that, you would have to wait until newsfeed gives it to you. The idea of a news tab would be you can go and look for news and be exposed to more news. And look, to date, our hope has been that we aren't making payments so that publishers become dependent on the payments, that publishers should be able to, again, monetize directly and have a direct relationship with their audiences rather than it coming through Facebook so they can know them through instant articles. I think as we move into a news surface, what we're going to explore is how do we do that even more? How do we make sure that publishers are getting the money they need to do this great work?
So the FBI and the SEC are investigating Facebook along with a dozen states. The FTC was also investigating and is now negotiating a multi-billion-dollar fine with Facebook, not to mention ongoing investigations in Europe and other parts of the world. Most of that was prompted by Cambridge Analytica. And that's, there have been a lot of PR issues with Facebook recently. And just yesterday, millions of Facebook users' information was found to be exposed on a cloud computing server. So Facebook sort of has something of an image problem. Do you feel that has led inside to a siege mentality? And I'm thinking of things like the headlines we saw earlier this year about efforts to investigate whether George Soros had a financial incentive for attacking Facebook, and that really kind of blew up. Can you just respond to that?
There's so much in there. I think to your question of whether there's a siege mentality, it may be surprising. There isn't, and I think there's so many people at Facebook who went to the company. We're, like Audrey said, we're in San Francisco, we're in the Bay Area. There's a lot of idealistic people who went there because they wanted to help connect the world. I went there to learn a lot about the news industry, but also because my whole life has been dedicated to helping people get the news and information they want and need. There are so many things that we should have done differently in recent years and that I know we're working hard to fix. And I mean, it's not to downplay the mistakes of the last few years and things we could have changed, but the people I work with anyway are so committed to doing it and to trying to get it right. And honestly, being able to hear the feedback from the publishers and the members of Congress, as hard as it is sometimes, is key to that.
We're almost done. We're out of time, but I want to just ask one thing. The 2016 election was a real moment of reckoning for Facebook. When you look to 2020, and for a lot of people, but when you look to 2020, what's the thing that you're doing that's different to not repeat the same mistakes?
Oh gosh, so many things. And actually, you saw that in 2018, the midterms were not a story on Facebook because we had already taken so many steps to try to work much harder on misinformation, which is a whole other 45 minutes we could do up here, to make sure that we're removing fake accounts. We take down 1 million of them a day, which is a lot of where the most damaging stuff comes from. We've got a whole teams that work on civic engagement and integrity that are gearing up for that. We've hired 30,000 people around content. So there's a lot that's going on. That said, I think we all know that, like crime, the bad actors are always changing their ways. And so I think we're having to stay vigilant and try to think around the corner. I hope we can do it right.
We'll have to have you back to discuss all
of those. You bet, I would love to.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Eugene Scott. I'm a political reporter for The Fix, which is our political analysis blog here at The Washington Post. And I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. Most of my professional career has been spent in local journalism in great cities like Charlotte and Kansas City and Phoenix. And so I know how important what we are about to discuss actually is. So let me take this moment to introduce to you the guests we have here who are far more insightful on the ground than I am here, and hopefully we all can learn some things about where we're going in journalism. First, we have Louise Kiernan, editor-in-chief of ProPublica Illinois, the nonprofit first state-level operation. Louise came to ProPublica from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, where she taught for 6 years. Previously, she worked at the Chicago Tribune for 18 years as a reporter and editor. While there, she won a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. Also with us, we have venture capitalist John Thornton, founder of the Texas Tribune and co-founder of the American Journalism Project, a new effort aimed at reinvigorating local news through the power of venture philanthropy. And lastly, we have John Ralston, editor and founder of the Nevada Independent, a nonprofit news site covering breaking news and important stories across the state of Nevada. Today, we're going to be taking a look at innovative nonprofit models of local journalism and discuss the opportunities and challenges of supplying and financing these ventures. A reminder to our audience, that you can tweet questions to us this morning using the hashtag #PostLive. First, I want to start with John Thornton. So you founded the American Journalism Project. You had a goal of raising $1 billion annually for this venture. I read last week that you've raised about $42 million so far, and you did that in 6 months. Can you give us an update on what that process has been like?
It's been exhilarating, terrifying, just about any adjective you can think of, depending on the day. Just to clarify, the American Journalism Project is based on 3 interlocking beliefs. That democracy and journalism are interdependent, that at the local level, journalism is a public good, that the market, left to its own devices, won't supply adequately. It's another way of saying a market failure. And the third is that market failure is not something that our commerce or our government is going to solve. And so what we say is this is a we the people problem. With regard to local news institutions, we become fond of saying that we're all owners now. And so when we talk about $1 billion a year, what we think of is a news infrastructure that is not unlike public radio, that's about $1 billion a year infrastructure. We've raised $42 million toward an ultimate target of $100 million to serve as a sort of force multiplier and catalyst to bring philanthropic capital into the space and also increase the commercial capabilities of these nonprofit news institutions.
Awesome. Okay. And John Ralston, you have a long career as a veteran journalist in Nevada, and you've written for all the big newspapers and hosted public affairs television before you founded The Independent. Like, why did you feel the need to found that, considering that you have operated in so many different aspects of journalism in the state? Was there a particular gap you felt needed to be filled?
It's a great question. First of all, I'll translate. Veteran just means old, I think, in what Gene was saying. After my last TV gig ended in 2016, I really started thinking about, I've been talking a lot today about news deserts. And the media market had changed a lot in Nevada. The biggest Republican donor in the world bought the biggest newspaper. Sheldon Adelson bought the Review-Journal. The other newspaper in Las Vegas essentially was fading. And so I said, there's an opportunity here. There's an opportunity to do what John suggested because democracy is so dependent on robust journalism. And I said, you know what, I think the nonprofit model is the future of journalism, unless you happen to run into a Sheldon Adelson or a Jeff Bezos, perhaps. If your best friend is not a billionaire, you got to raise the money. You got to do this. It has been all the adjectives John used for what he's doing apply. It has been the most exhilarating and most exhausting thing I have ever done. As you mentioned, I was out front being a columnist, being a public affairs host. This is now nothing to do with me. It's these great young journalists I've hired who are producing this product. We've been alive now for a little over 2 years, and people are embracing it. People are supporting us. And I really do believe it's the future. There are other people around the country who are starting these up, who I talk to, who call me and say, I like what you're doing. How did you start it? And I said, let me tell you. And John deserves credit. And I'm not just saying this because I want some of his $1 billion. I'm saying the Texas Tribune is the model for us all. They are fantastically successful. Evan Smith has been a genius in what he's done with that. And if every state could replicate that, I think the future of journalism would be robust.
Awesome, awesome. Luis, well, let's talk about your state. We know that ProPublica as a whole is doing some really phenomenal work. But one interesting thing we see them doing is partnering with local joint investigations. From your perspective, is collaboration the answer? Have you seen opportunities and results come from collaboration that perhaps could not have resulted from independent work?
Absolutely. And collaboration has been part of ProPublica's DNA since it was started a decade ago in 2008. And so when we opened 18 months ago, we brought that same philosophy to bear. And We have so far, in our 18 months of publication, partnered with just about every local news organization in Chicago, from other small startups like us, including Block Club Chicago, which is a hyper-local news site, as well as both of our major newspapers and the public radio station, along with a number of smaller news outlets throughout the state of Illinois. And what we've found is collaboration allows us to bring different resources and strengths to bear on a story, and it enables us to reach broader and more diverse audiences that we wouldn't be able to reach on our own.
Absolutely. So speaking of reaching broader audiences, John, you're very active on social media, on Twitter. How have you used social media to reach new audiences in Nevada that perhaps could not have been reached prior to you starting The Independent?
Sometimes not so well, sometimes better than others. Social media is both the greatest thing and the worst thing out there, as many of us in journalism and elsewhere know. But I try to use it. I still do political commentary, and which is my bread and butter. But what I really try to use Twitter now for is for what you suggested, which is to try to create awareness of the Nevada Independent and what we are doing, and to announce. When we're doing events, we do events, as the Texas Tribune does, that we call Indie Talks or Indie Forums, where I've interviewed the governor, or we have a panel on an issue of the day, like education and education funding. But you know, any nonprofit is going to have a limited marketing budget, right? And we've tried some different kinds of ways to get the word out. What's really interesting, real quickly, about The Independent, and it'll surprise a lot of people, and constantly surprises me, is we can see who our audience is. And half of our audience is outside of Nevada. We are a local, fairly hyper-local, but DC and New York and LA make up almost half of our audience, which I think is partly because people know about my coverage of politics, and they figure that there's some of that. But that while that's great, it's also, it shows me that we're just not as well known as we should be in Nevada, that there are a lot of people who, and I still run into people saying, I love your show. I haven't been on TV in 3.5 years. Let me tell you what I'm doing now. And so I try to really use social media. We have a Facebook page. We have an account on Twitter to try to create awareness of what we are doing.
You mentioned marketing, and I just wanted to pivot to John talking dollars and cents again. Obviously, you want high-impact, mission-driven reporting, but what about revenue goals? What do you hope a return on your investment would look like at the Texas Tribune?
Well, at the Texas Tribune or the American Journalism Project, which?
If you could give us both, that would be great.
Well, what the Tribune has done exceedingly well, and almost uniquely well, is diversify their revenue sources in a way that a lot of nonprofit news organizations have not been able to. And so when you look at the annual investment that the Trib makes in personnel that do major gifts, solicitation, membership work, commercial sponsorship work, the return on investment is more than 5 times the annual compensation, fully burdened for overhead, fully burdened for benefits of those people. And so what we're trying to do at AJP is replicate that, probably not at that success level, but what we hope is that we're going to make grants to organizations with which they're not going to hire journalists, they're going to hire revenue-producing, technology-enabling people who then will, we hope, produce some multiple of that grant in perpetuity. And so we become fond of saying that when a source of journalism philanthropy thinks of funding a newsroom, you almost guarantee that you're going to continue to fund that newsroom. What we're trying to do is fund integrated media organizations with diverse revenue streams, or at least enable what are currently kind of newsrooms shaking their tin cup for grants, enable them to be integrated media organizations with diverse revenue streams.
And have you announced those first grant recipients? Do you know who they are?
We haven't. We are fast and furiously we're trying to raise money and give away at the same time, which is new in my 6th decade. Our time frame is by June. We hope to have the criteria and processes sort of concretized and communicated to the field, and then we'll hopefully be in the grant-making business by the 4th quarter.
Awesome. Luis, you talked earlier about how ProPublica was partnering with a diverse type of news organizations. Can you talk a bit about how that has allowed you to reach new audiences that perhaps you would not have without the partnerships?
Certainly. First of all, obviously we're small and new, so it helps us reach more people just at a very base level, but it also helps us reach people who are most impacted by the reporting. And so just for one example, we did an investigation into some research gone awry at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and our partners on that story were the Chicago Sun-Times, which is a local newspaper, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. And with those two partners, we were able to reach very different audiences, but both of whom were very much engaged and impacted by the reporting.
Awesome, awesome. John, you spoke earlier about TV and coming from TV. We know that the Indy's doing like some experimental things with video and podcasts and things like that. What other things are you all doing trying to expand the brand of the Independent within the state? You mentioned earlier it's a bit of a challenge, helping people be aware of you.
Yeah, I worked in all of the media. I started as a print journalist and then did some online stuff, and I did TV for a long time. As you said, video on the internet, there's a lot of people know, a lot of news sites know. It's still tough to engage people unless you do it in a creative and generally in a short way. People are not going to watch long videos. We have started doing some. I just hired a multimedia editor, and he's starting to produce videos. We're doing short ones. The legislature is now in session in Nevada, explaining how a bill becomes a law. Kinds of things, or they just passed a background checks bill. Here's what the gun laws are in Nevada. And if you do these things in a creative way, I think it can engage people. We have a podcast, but it's a little bit frustrating because again, I go back to what I talked about before, just to get people's awareness of a podcast. And there's so many podcasts out there that people listen to that it's tough to pierce all of that. But we are experimenting more with video. I mentioned we do these events, and we put those on video. We have what we call an Indy TV page now, where we live stream events just as this one's being live streamed, and we archive them all. And we find that people are going to watch some of that stuff, but not in great numbers. And so I think that's all going to evolve. I think it's all going to change as the world of journalism and the internet changes. But the bottom line is, and I'm sure you know this too, is we're willing to try almost anything, to get attention. It is tough when there's to get through and to get people interested in what we do.
Luis, you were talking earlier about being able to reach new audiences with your partnership with the Sun-Times and with the Chronicle. 2 questions. One, what's the most efficient way to reach new audiences, or let me say, what's the most efficient way to support local news, and what type of local news do you support personally yourself?
Ooh, there's a lot of good questions in there. I mean, I have to say fundamentally, I think that the best way to reach audiences is through great journalism, and that lies at the very heart of what we do. And as John said, we're experimenting with a lot of different ways to bring people into our work, not just when it's done, but throughout the entire process. We, for example, have a very lively Facebook group for people who are interested in issues around parking tickets in Chicago, because we have done an ongoing investigation into how the city's ticketing system disproportionately impacts poor minority drivers. And that has been a way to bring a lot of people into our stories there. We also try to engage audiences, not just through social media, but in real life. We have done things like conduct a series of performance workshops around the state in different small communities to enable citizens to talk to one another about the issues of concern to them and ideally to surface ideas for us to report about. We've even done things like mail out copies of our stories to people that we know are affected by them but aren't on the internet necessarily to see them. And so that, I think, is some of the ways we're thinking about reaching audiences in new and creative ways. As far as, what local media do I consume? A lot. And we're fortunate in Chicago in that we do have a small but very energetic group of journalism startups, including us. So some of the organizations I follow include City Bureau, which is a civic engagement focused organization, Block Club Chicago, which is hyper-local, Chalkbeat Chicago, which is an offshoot of Chalkbeat covering education news. I follow both of our newspapers, obviously. My husband works at one of them, so I better. The radio station, I think all of it, right?
There's a lot of bad news often coming out of our industry. I was very interested in hearing any of you share, what are you most hopeful and optimistic about?
Well, $300 million for the Knight Foundation is a pretty good start. If you think about this notion of journalism philanthropy and how new it really is. I mean, it was only a generation ago that newspapers were more concerned about being regulated as monopolies than they were about existential risk. And so I get impatient because I feel like journalism philanthropy in this country needs to be 10 times bigger than it is, and it does. I want it to happen faster, but then I'm reminded that in philanthropic time, a generation is kind of an eye blink. And so I think we've got a lot to be encouraged about, and I think Knight and increasingly others like them are playing a lead role.
I don't think you can be doing what any of us are doing, including what John does, which is if you didn't believe in this, if you weren't hopeful about the future, if you didn't think that even though maybe the old models are breaking down, that there is a new way to do this, and the importance of the work that we are doing. I mean, just anecdotally, there was a reporter who covered politics for the Review-Journal, which is Adelson's paper, who came to me last year and said, listen, I'm going to leave. I love what you're doing. I'm going to go home to San Jose. I want to start up a nonprofit with my husband. And so I gave her some advice. She left the RJ after the election. She is now up in San Jose. She started something called the San Jose Spotlight with her husband, which you should all check out. And she, she says everything I told her about it is right, which all of us know. It's exhilarating. It's exhausting. There's things that you thought you could anticipate that you couldn't anticipate, but she's doing it. She loves doing it, and it's going to keep happening, I believe, because there are people out there like Louise and myself and others who believe in this model, who believe that there is a yearning out there in the public. Not everybody hates the media, despite our rating. There is a yearning out there for information that people can trust, that is deep, that has an effect on their lives. And so, does that not sound hopeful to everybody?
Well, Louise, speaking about the future, and maybe you could add this to your answer. I mean, you come from a background in academia, and so I'm very interested in how that shapes your views.
I think one gift I brought from the classroom back into the newsroom, and one reason I was so excited to step back into a newsroom is it really imbued me with a sense of optimism to be surrounded by all the bright, talented young people who want to go into journalism, who really see this as a mission, and who I think the future is in good hands. And I think it's our job to make sure it's there so they can take it over.
Awesome. That is encouraging. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have. I didn't take any of your questions because I had so many. But you can tweet them on Post Live. Their Twitter handles are all on the Washington Post Live Twitter account. And I want to thank you, John, and Luis. And now we will move to the next portion of our program. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Margaret Sullivan, media columnist of the Washington Post, and I'm very happy to be here today with three incredible journalists. We're really very lucky to have them with us and to hear about their work. I'm delighted to introduce them. Andrew Chavez, senior computational reporter at the Dallas Morning News. He was part of the team whose investigation, Pain and Profit, revealed that thousands of Texans were being denied life-sustaining drugs and treatments by private contractors hired by the state to manage their treatment. Next to him is Julie K. Brown, an investigative reporter at the Miami Herald, whose recent investigation, Perversion of Justice, just won a Polk Award. It examines the plea deal given to affluent Palm Beach sex abuser Jeffrey Epstein. And sitting closest to me here is Sasha Pfeiffer, investigations correspondent at NPR. Sasha was part of the Boston Globe's Spotlight team that won the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service after revealing the Catholic Church's cover-up of widespread clergy sexual abuse. So we are really very lucky to have them, and we'll get into it right now. So you've all done outstanding investigations work at local newspapers and other organizations. Something I think people don't always understand is how time-consuming that reporting is. So tell us a little bit, using your specific experiences, why it takes so long. Andrew.
Sure. So, we were dealing with this massive system. It was the single it's the biggest line item in the Texas budget. It's regulated by the largest state agency in the country that has like about 50,000 employees. And so to get inside of that takes a huge amount of effort. We ended up, by the time we were done with this, with, I want to say, around 70,000 pages of records. So, you can imagine that reading that and understanding that and unpacking that takes a huge amount of time. And then also turning around and boiling that down in a way that we can explain it to people and make them care about the stories of the people that we're telling. It's a huge undertaking. And, obviously making sure that all of that is accurate, and, it's a huge amount of work, and it takes a lot of time, and you don't see the efforts until the end, so when we
How long did it take?
About 18 months. And that was with us doing other stuff, in between, off and on. But it was well over a year to find this story.
And well worth it.
Absolutely.
Julie, how about you?
Well, I began this story probably as a result of some tips that I got about this case, which had been written about pretty widely over the past 10 years. It was a 10-year-old case. I sort of approached this case. There's, of course, lots and lots of documents, and I approached this case the way that I think a police detective who joins the force opens up a box and has a cold case, and they decide they want to, do a forensic examination of it after all these years. So what do? You have to go over every single piece of evidence all over again. And what happens when you do that sometimes is you discover new things in that evidence, or you find people who back then didn't want to talk and maybe they want to talk. In this particular case, I actually began this project which was about the abuse of probably hundreds of young teenage girls in Palm Beach by a very wealthy billionaire. I began it by trying to figure out who the girls were because they were underage. Nobody knew who they were. And I thought to myself, if I could get them now, they were teenagers then and now they're in their 30s, they might be willing to talk about this, especially in the wake of Alexander Acosta, the prosecutor, being nominated for President Trump's cabinet post. So it just took a long time to, just deconstruct the whole case, find the women, and, start from scratch, essentially.
Congratulations on the work. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Sasha, you've done a lot of interesting work, and I guess well, not even perhaps, but the most high profile of which was the Boston Globe Spotlight series or investigation that was turned into a movie that we've all seen, right? So, let's talk about how long it took to do that investigation.
That was a relatively quick investigation, only because part of it involved us trying to unseal some public records with the help of the Globe's lawyers. The lawyers were successful, and suddenly we had a date when we knew public records were going to be released, which meant they would be open to other media outlets as well. So we really had to race to make sure the reporting we had done for about 5 or 6 months didn't go to waste and we could have our story. But there is often a huge public records element to these stories, and it takes a long time to find them, to get them, to appeal rejections of public records requests. In the movie, there's a scene where we realize that if you go through the annual directories of the Archdiocese of Boston, you can track what priests are in which churches and where they've been moved over the years. In the movie, it was about a 3-minute exciting montage of us in different places going through the directories. In real life, it was 3 weeks of absolute tedium that I think probably damaged all of our eyesight because we were having to so carefully go through these directories. But that's the reality of this work. Time-consuming, sometimes tedious, but a big payoff in the end, but not quick.
Right, exactly. So one of the things that I worry about as someone who cares a lot about local journalism is that investigative journalism is so time-consuming and so expensive to do because of the amount of staff and perhaps lawyers' fees and all of that kind of thing, that in this troubled time for local journalism, we won't be able to do as much of it. So I guess what I want to ask you is, when there aren't enough people to go around in Metro Daily newsrooms that have lost staff, should investigative journalism get higher priority than routine coverage of local government meetings and so on, which also are important? How do you prioritize? I mean, maybe we have a little bit of a bias for investigative journalism here, but how do you see it? I'll start again with you, Andrew.
Well, I don't think it's an either or necessarily. I think that all of those things can be covered with an investigative focus. We're fortunate in our newsroom that we still do have a robust investigative team. But like I said, that whole time where we were working on this project, we weren't out doing those sorts of things. But I think that the two have to happen together. We found this story because my reporting partner was out on the beat and was in Austin and was hearing things that ended up being some of the main findings in our series. So, I think they have to both happen together, and I think that the more we cover things through that investigative accountability lens, the better our work is.
Right, and as you say, and this is sort of a truism in newsrooms, but certainly want to share it with you, is that the best investigations, many of them do come out of beat reporting. So there's kind of a double whammy that's happening here. As there are fewer beat reporters out there, there are fewer sort of tips or knowledge. There's nobody at City Hall all day long. And so we may not know as much of what's going on. Julie, how do you see it?
Well, I remember the line that former Speaker Tip O'Neill once said, which was, "All politics is local." And at the Herald, we place a great emphasis on local reporting, and we have a great staff, tenacious staff. We always feel like we kind of play over our weight. We always punch over our weight. So we have a lot of reporters who, even the story that we just are working on now about Cindy Yang and the Chinese woman that got arrested at Mar-a-Lago. We've been working on that story and getting tip after tip after tip. And some of the people that get the tips are the beat reporters, and some of them and our investigative reporters then pair up with the beat reporters in order to make these stories happen. So I think that's part of the ways that we are trying to do investigative journalism and local journalism at the same time.
And at the Herald, is there a special team, like a spotlight team, or are the investigative reporters kind of worked into the newsroom as a whole? I mean, how sequestered are they?
Both. I mean, we have a core investigative team, but those members of the team work with some of the beat reporters when something happens. We're very good at that. We're very collegial because we all are excited about good stories.
Right.
So you know, it's exciting to work with younger reporters, quite frankly, who know how to do social media a little bit better than older reporters. And everybody has their specialty, and that's what makes what we do work, quite frankly.
Sasha, so you've moved to NPR, and you may see this question from a couple different directions. How would you prioritize?
This will be an unsatisfying answer for managers and editors who have to make the calls about how to allocate resources, but I do think you have to try to preserve both, because stories really do bubble up. Mm-hmm. There's a little paper in the Blackstone Valley which covers about 24 communities in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And a tweet from a reporter there got a lot of attention recently because he said, I'm often the only reporter at municipal meetings I go to, and many municipal meetings I'm not able to attend. And he was reflecting on what does that mean for local news coverage or lack of local news coverage. And you know, we have to try to find a way, I think, to think differently about how we cover news, because things are not good for newspapers. I want to be optimistic, but the prospects are not good. And I think we need to find different ways to collaborate, to maybe think less competitively and more collaboratively, to find ways to pair newspapers with public radio, with nonprofits, because the end goal is covering the news, even if it's not to get it first or only, I think.
Right, and that sort of plays into my next question for all of you, which is that you've done a lot of most of the work that's been done on this panel has been done at newspapers, and newspapers, local, regional newspapers, are really under fire and really under siege. I think we put the numbers up on the board earlier, but there's a recent Pew study that says that, you know, most people, 71% of people, you know, American citizens, don't realize that local news is anything but financially healthy, when the reality is we're really, really in trouble. So, you know, to what extent do you think the new nonprofits and other organizations that we're seeing come up can do the work that's been traditionally done by local newspapers? Andrew?
Well, I think there's great potential. I think there's great potential, and I welcome all journalism, you know, in whatever form and however it's paid for. And I think we're starting to see that right now, both through the collaborations, you know, the ProPublica local reporting network came up earlier, and through, you know, the little smaller nonprofits that are popping up around the country. My home state of New Mexico, you know, I see investigative stories coming from nonprofits there that directly impact the rural area where my parents live, where there is a lack of, you know, it was one of those news deserts in the map earlier, and I'm seeing stories now that are coming out due to that, due to those nonprofits, and that if it were going to happen without those nonprofits, I think it would have happened already. So I absolutely welcome it.
Julie, how do you see it? Is there going to be enough to supplement what's being lost?
I hope so. I think that it's already starting to work for a lot of newspapers to work collaboratively with some of these organizations like the Pulitzer Center. McClatchy just did a big piece, that's our parent company, did a big project where we joined together with 10 of our local newspapers and The Trace, which is a nonprofit media organization that has been advocating for gun control. And we did this very powerful piece all over the country and all the gun deaths that had happened. We did it just by all working together along with The Trace to do that, and it was pretty powerful.
You guys are so hopeful. I love it. I actually am not, but but that's okay. Sasha, I want to start with you on this next question. Non-journalists don't always understand how we do our work. What would you like people to know about how investigative journalists work beyond what they learned in Spotlight?
You know, Spotlight many people after seeing that movie would say things like, do you really go out and knock on doors like that?
Yeah.
And I thought, that is such a basic part of our job. I can't believe people would be surprised we do it. But as we've learned from the study you mentioned, where people don't know about the health of news, there's a lot people don't realize. I guess I hope people realize how, you know, really good reporters put a lot of time and energy and thought into doing this. We take time, we try to be very fair, we try to talk to as many people. I guess I wish people understood how much hard work and effort goes into it. I know that's a very broad answer, but I think that there's an enormous payoff when it's done really well, and I wish people would be aware of what's lost when you don't have it.
Julie, what do you wish people understood or would
Well,
like them to understand?
You know, a lot of these stories, you go after very powerful people, and it's you know, it's sometimes intimidating, and you have, fortunately, I work for a newspaper that supports me, but every day you're out there really fighting for records, fighting to talk to people who often don't want to talk to you, and then, you know, you often have people that then come after you, and I don't know how much the public really realize how much we really fight for the work that we do in some cases.
And Andrew?
That what we do costs money, and that if you read one of these stories and the box pops up and you think that it's important and that it made the world a better place, put in your credit card and make it happen some more. Because, you know, I mean, just on this story alone, we spent over $20,000 just fighting records requests.
Yeah.
I mean, we got the salaries of 2 people for 18 months. You know, and the massive team that went into editing it and shooting the photos, and you know, and the tedium that Sasha talked about. I mean, that's absolutely a part of this. It's incredibly time-consuming work, and it's not cheap.
Right. Investigative journalism is often judged by results or impact, legislative reform, for example. Is this, in your opinion, the main way we should judge the quality of investigative reporting? Sasha?
I think that's a hard question. I know that ProPublica has really wrestled with what is the meaning of impact. Actually, I want to say one other thing about something else you asked, and then maybe I'll pass that question to someone else. In terms of collaboration.
Very clever.
The Knight Foundation is an example of this, pouring money into news organizations. ProPublica has tried to create these open source data tools, software that they can give to other news outlets so that they can do their own data-driven investigations. NPR has created this collaborative journalism network where they say, look, we've got 1,800 reporters, 200 bureaus around the country, regional coverage, beat expertise. If we think of it as sort of a nationwide network of bureaus, we can try to replace what is being lost by newspapers. And I feel like that is what we need to begin to try to experiment and do. If we can't totally save all our newspapers, and if a lot of those print reporters are coming into places like radio, we need to find ways to integrate them so that we can continue doing what we used to do in a different way.
And fast, right?
Yes, and fast. And impact.
Impact, yes.
How
important is?
Of course, impact is important.
I mean, how important is sort of legislative reform and, you know, measurable change, I guess, is what I'm saying.
We were just talking about that, in that it seems like when these projects, you know, they launch, and then there's all this fanfare, and we got to do something, we got to change this, and it often happens. And I think one thing that all media doesn't do enough of is to keep following up on those stories after those, because often what happens is there's all this legislation that's proposed, and then, you know, 6 months down the line, whatever happened to that bill, you know? So I think that the media needs to do a little bit better job of pushing for that. And one way to do that is really to have some people in the community. Often when these stories break, you always have activists that get involved, and have them. When I did the Florida Prison Project, I couldn't possibly keep up with all the reforms that were happening, but a lot of the activists that came, that rose from the project, really worked with me to keep. You know, they had marches in Tallahassee about prison reform, and it helped that there was a good community of people that became activists as a result of the stories that I did.
And Andrew, maybe a way to answer this is to describe what impact has come from pain and profit.
Sure. So, you know, we found a wide number we found a huge number of flaws in the system for caring for these elderly and really sick kids. You know, everything from the doctors that were promised were not actually there. You know, services were being denied. There was a wide range of things, and we have seen a package of bills that's moving through the legislature right now to address almost all of those things. I think there's over 20 bills, one of which is a big omnibus bill that sort of just ticks through the story almost. And I do think that matters. And I think that it's a good sign, frankly, that you're writing about things that can actually be fixed. You know, it's a good sign that you're writing about things that are actually resonating with people. And I think that the more that we can present our stories in a way that actually provides those solutions, in addition to just pointing out the problems, the better our work is.
I'm guessing that there was a lot of public response to the series.
There were legislative hearings, in the weeks that followed, where many of the people from our stories got to come up to the dais and tell their legislators. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I have many more questions, and I know that we could talk about this for a long time, but we're actually just about out of time. So I want to thank this fabulous panel for the work they've done and for being here. If you would like to watch full interviews or highlights from today's program, you can do so at WashingtonPostLive.com. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks to you. Thank you. Yeah.